Sunday used to be my favorite day. When Harold was alive, he'd hum his way through breakfast while I sliced fruit or fussed with the kettle. We'd argue playfully over the newspaper. He wanted the crossword first. I insisted on the front page. Then we'd set the table for lunch and wait for David to arrive, sometimes with a friend or some new girl he thought was serious. The house felt alive then, filled with chatter and spilled lemonade and the smell of roast chicken that clung to the curtains long after the plates were cleared. Now, Sunday lunch feels like a scheduled obligation, a box my son checks before moving on with the rest of his life. They arrive at 100 sharp, never early, never late. David kisses my cheek the same way someone signs for a package. Lynette gives me one of those tight-lipped smiles, the kind that says, "Let's just get through this." Their kids, Emma and Jacob, barely look up from their phones, and when they do, it's usually to ask for the Wi-Fi password again, even though I've written it on a sticky note right by the fridge. I still make the roast chicken. Old habits die hard. I still set the table with the good plates Harold bought me for our 40th anniversary, even though Lynette once rolled her eyes and said, "You know we're not royalty, right?" She doesn't mean to be cruel. At least, I try to believe that. But it's hard not to notice the way she wipes the forks with a napkin before using them. Or how she talks about me like I'm not in the room. "She's been forgetting a lot lately, hasn't she?" she said last week, while I was sitting 2 feet away buttering a roll. I hear everything. I just choose when to respond. David used to talk to me. Really talk. He'd call during the week and tell me about work, about stress, about dreams. Now his visits are full of surface-level niceties and awkward silences. If I ask too many questions, he checks his watch. If I mention Harold or memories from when David was a boy, he shifts in his seat and says, "Let's not dwell." They leave by 230, always, like they're racing a clock. "Thanks for lunch, Mom." "Bye, Grandma." Door, silence, echoes. Once the house goes quiet again, I clean the kitchen by myself. I used to leave the dishes for later, but these days, cleaning gives my hands something to do. I've found that grief shrinks when you're scrubbing something, even if it's just a casserole dish you barely touched. Afterward, I sit in the armchair by the window and watch the birds peck around the feeder. Sometimes I talk to them. Not out loud, not yet, but in my mind, I tell them things I can't tell anyone else. It's strange. I never expected to be so invisible. When you're young, you think old age will come with a kind of reverence, like people will lean in closer, eager to hear the stories you've gathered over the years. But what I've found is that the older you get, the more you fade. People don't ask what you think anymore. They don't wonder what you want. They assume you're tired, that you're content, that you're just sitting around, waiting for the end. But I remember the woman I was. I remember running through the rain in college, laughing until my ribs ached. I remember dancing in the kitchen with Harold to the sound of static on the radio. I remember teaching David to tie his shoes, to ride a bike, to look people in the eye when he spoke. I was not always this still, this small. I miss being needed. I miss being seen. But most of all, I miss the Sundays that felt like belonging, not like a performance I've been allowed to keep hosting out of pity. Still, I smile. I set the table. I nod when Lynette mentions her Pilates class and laugh at Jacob's half-hearted jokes. Because that's what's expected of me. That's what mothers do. Until, of course, the day you hear the truth, the day that quiet, aching sadness hardens into something sharper. But that part of the story hasn't come yet. Not today. It was a cold Sunday, one of those overcast afternoons when the clouds hang heavy like wet laundry. The kind of day that makes the house feel colder than it really is, even with the heat turned up. Lunch had gone the usual way, Lynette commenting that the chicken was a little dry, David checking his phone under the table, and the kids glued to their screens. I smiled. I passed the rolls. I laughed at something I didn't quite catch. They left the dishes in the sink again. I didn't mind. It gave me something to do. After they'd all wandered upstairs to grab their coats, I realized I'd left my shawl folded over the back of my bedroom chair. My joints had started to ache with the weather, and that old knitted shawl, the one Harold gave me for our last anniversary, still gave a kind of comfort nothing else could. I moved quietly, as I often do. Years of living in a house that echoes when you breathe wrong had taught me to tread soft, to close doors gently. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard voices, hushed, low, coming from my bedroom. The door was nearly shut, just enough for sound to slip through like steam from a kettle. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. Truly, I didn't. I paused only for a moment, then I heard David's voice, clearer than I'd expected. She's just waiting to die, let's just be patient. My knees locked. There was a pause, then Lynette replied, we can't keep circling. The house alone is worth at least 600. Once she's gone, we sell it, split the rest. David grunted. She won't last much longer, she's barely moving around now, another winter like this and, he didn't finish the sentence, they were talking about me, about my death. My home, my will, as if I were already gone. I stood in the hallway, still as stone, the air pressed against my chest like a vice. I could hear the rustling of coats, the jingle of car keys, the casual way they moved about, unburdened by shame, unaware that the woman they were appraising like an expired appliance was just 10 feet away, hearing every word. I should have burst in, said something, demanded an explanation, thrown a glass, shouted his name, David. The way I used to when he scraped his knees and needed me. But I didn't. Instead, I turned, walked back down the stairs, and sat at the kitchen table. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and stared out the window at the frozen garden. The bird feeder hung empty. Not even the sparrows had come. A few minutes later, I heard them come down, laughing, of all things. David kissed the top of my head like nothing had happened. We'll get going, Mom. Take it easy, all right? Lynette chimed in. Don't forget your pills? I nodded, smiled, wished them a good week. Told the kids to be kind to their teachers. The front door closed, I exhaled. Something inside me shifted that day, something slow but permanent. Like a hairline crack in old porcelain, invisible unless you're looking closely, but deep enough to split it in two with just the right pressure. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. Impatience, entitlement, a cold certainty that I was no longer a person to them, just a stepping stone on their way to comfort, a locked door between them and what they believed was owed. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but the tears never came. Instead, I stood up and washed the dishes. Every fork, every plate. I dried them by hand and stacked them neatly where they belonged. Then I went upstairs and sat in the very chair where Lynette had just calculated my worth like a ledger sheet. I wrapped the shawl around my shoulders, and I sat there for a long time, thinking, not about how much they'd hurt me, but about what I would do next. I didn't sleep much that night. The words replayed in my mind like a broken hymn, she's just waiting to die. I kept hearing David's voice, my son's voice. Flat, practical, without hesitation, not even a trace of guilt. By dawn, I had already made up my mind. I brewed my tea stronger than usual and stood by the window while the kettle hissed behind me. The garden was dusted in frost, each blade of grass stiff with winter's breath. The bird feeder swung gently in the wind, still no visitors. I got dressed in my wool skirt and navy coat, the one with the velvet buttons Harold had always said made me look like I ran the town, and called the only person I trusted with the gravity of what needed to be done. Mr. Walker. He'd been my attorney for 34 years. He handled Harold's will, helped us buy this house, advised us when David had his first scrape with a business loan in his 20s. He'd aged gently, white hair, kind eyes, and a voice that never rushed. I told him over the phone, I need to make some changes, today if possible. He didn't ask why, just said, come in at 10, Margaret, I'll clear my schedule. I brought him a tin of shortbread. He didn't touch it too polite, but thanked me all the same. We sat at his oak desk while I explained, clearly and calmly, that I no longer wished to leave anything to my son. Not the house, not the savings, nothing, I said. He's chosen a different path, so have I. Mr. Walker blinked once, then nodded. He didn't press for details. He knew me well enough to understand I wasn't speaking out of bitterness. This wasn't anger, this was clarity. I listed my wishes plainly, the house and all personal belongings to go to my niece, Clara. The remaining financial assets to be split between Clara's children's college fund and a newly established trust, the Harold M. Whitaker Literacy Endowment. Harold believed books could fix anything, I said. I'd like that to be his legacy. Mr. Walker tapped his pen against the desk. You know this will cause conflict. I smiled faintly. Conflict already exists, Thomas. This just evens the field. We signed everything that day. Proper witnesses, legal stamps, clear, notarized documentation, and then I asked for one more favor. I'd like a second physical copy, not just the one you keep on file. He raised an eyebrow, but obliged. I brought it home in a plain brown envelope, tucked beneath my coat. I didn't want it in my desk drawer. David had been through my things before. He'd once borrowed my engagement ring to have it appraised without asking. Claimed he was thinking of getting something similar for Lynette. Instead, I walked out to the garden shed. It was chilly inside, that kind of damp cold that seeps into your bones. The smell of earth, rusted tools, and forgotten summers hung in the air. I moved aside a stack of old pots and lifted the wooden crate where I stored Harold's gardening gloves and tomato stakes. Beneath a half-used bag of soil and some cracked terracotta saucers, I found the metal box we used to keep spare keys in. I cleaned it out, lined it with plastic, and carefully slid the envelope inside. Then I resealed the soil bag and covered it all up again. Let them keep thinking I'm old and soft and slow. Let them believe I'm harmless. There is power in being underestimated. As I stepped back into the yard, a gust of wind blew the last of the leaves across the lawn like scattered paper. I looked up at the house, the windows where David used to draw stick figures in condensation, the porch where Harold read the paper on summer mornings. I wasn't ready to leave it behind, but I was ready to make sure it went to someone who would never see me as a countdown. After that day in the garden shed, something inside me shifted, not like a door slamming shut, but like a lock sliding quietly into place. I began to watch, not with suspicion, but with purpose. I stopped filling the silences. I let the room do that work for me. David would visit once a week, usually alone now, always with some vague excuse. Just checking in, he'd say, or thought I'd swing by since I was in the neighborhood. But his eyes always darted past me, scanning the house like a surveyor. One Sunday, he opened the linen closet and commented, "Still a lot of stuff in here." Another time, he asked how often I used the upstairs rooms, followed by, "Wouldn't it be easier to be somewhere single level?" I smiled at him the way mothers do when they know more than they're letting on. Lynette came with him less and less. When she did, she brought pamphlets tucked inside her purse, places with names like Whispering Pines and Golden Haven. She never showed them to me directly, but I'd catch a glimpse when she slipped them out over coffee, flipping pages like she was browsing vacation homes. "You ever think about assisted living, Margaret?" she asked one day, eyes sweet but soulless. I tilted my head, as if giving it deep thought. "Oh, dear, that's for old people," she chuckled awkwardly. "Right, of course. Let them think I'm slow. It makes them bolder and me invisible, which, in its own way, is a kind of power. The more they underestimated me, the more I saw them clearly. I started taking long walks again, early in the morning before the neighborhood stirred. It felt good to feel the air on my face, the ground under my feet. It reminded me that I still had strength in my legs, breath in my lungs, stories in my bones. One of those stories, I decided, needed to be told, so I began writing. It started with a few notes scribbled on the back of grocery lists, then whole pages written in the margins of old crossword books. Eventually, I brought down the old typewriter from the attic. It was Harold's, clunky, loud, honest. I liked the weight of it. I set it up by the window in the den and wrote when no one was around. I wrote about my childhood, the first time I tasted snow, the day Harold kissed me under the university clock tower. I wrote about raising David, the sleepless nights, the scraped knees, the birthday cakes baked from scratch even when money was tight. I wrote about losing Harold. I wrote about the silence after. And then I wrote about the betrayal, not just the words I overheard, but the years of erosion that came before it. The way love had been replaced by transaction. The way my identity had been reduced to whatever asset could be counted or sold. It wasn't meant to be a book, not at first. But the more I wrote, the more I realized this wasn't just my story. It was the story of every woman who had ever been pushed gently to the edge of her own life. So I kept going. I called it the last word. Fitting, I thought. One afternoon, David caught sight of the typewriter. "What's that old thing doing out?" I looked at him and said brightly, "I'm just playing around with some letters. Helps keep the mind sharp." He nodded, uninterested. "Whatever keeps you busy, Mom." Exactly, I thought. Whatever keeps me busy. He didn't ask what I was writing. He never would. That was fine. I wasn't writing it for him. It happened on a Wednesday. Cloudy again, though warmer than usual, the kind of day that made the floorboards creak from expanding warmth. I'd been thinking about it for weeks, planning the details quietly in my head, the angle, the timing, the call, the expression I'd wear. Just after lunch, I waited until I knew they'd be arriving. David had mentioned stopping by, just for a few minutes. I stood at the bottom of the stairs with a glass in my hand, let it slip gently to the floor, then laid myself down beside it. Not dramatically, just enough to look fragile, unsteady, believable. Then I waited. They walked in moments later, calling out my name like it was a chore. "Mom," "Margaret," cue the gasp, the hurried footsteps. The way Lynette rushed to my side like she actually cared. Oh my God, are you okay? Did you fall? I blinked slowly, furrowing my brow. I must have slipped. It happened so fast. David helped me sit up, his hands shaking just slightly. You could have broken something. Jesus, Mom, you can't be by yourself like this. I let him help me onto the couch, clutching his arm like it was a lifeline. My heart wasn't racing, but I pretended it was. I even added a little quiver to my voice for effect. Lynette fetched a glass of water, her eyes darting. Maybe it's time we talk about next steps, she muttered, just loud enough. David nodded, distracted, rubbing his temples. Then he said the thing I was waiting for, the exact words, almost like they'd been rehearsed. Maybe it's time to get things in motion legally. Just in case. They weren't talking about doctors. They were talking about assets, about control, about me no longer as a person, but as a problem to manage, an estate to unlock. I excused myself to lie down, said I needed rest. Lynette helped me into the bedroom, fussed with the pillows. They thought I was too tired to notice, too frail to hear what came next, but I left the door open just an inch, just enough. In the hallway, I heard them whispering. She's declining, Lynette said. I don't want things to get messy later. We should meet with someone, maybe even get her to sign something now before. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. From my bed, I stared at the ceiling fan slowly turning above me, its blades slicing the light into patient little pieces. That's when it hit me they'd already mourned me. To them, I was already gone, a ghost in waiting. But lying there, listening to their shallow schemes and cold logistics, I had never felt more alive. There was a power in seeing their intentions so clearly, in knowing I was steps ahead of them. They were planning their future. What they didn't know was, I'd already sealed it. When the end came, it was quiet. I drifted off in my sleep one night in early spring, wrapped in my shawl, the house still smelling faintly of lavender and the roasted apples I'd baked earlier that day. No pain, no warning, just a breath that didn't come back. Clara was the one who found me. My sweet niece. She'd come by with her boys and a tin of muffins. I imagine the house must have felt still when she walked in, still in a way that said something was missing. Not just noise, but presence. She told me later she stood in the doorway for a long time before calling out, "Aunt Maggie?" I didn't answer, but I had already made sure everything else would. The funeral was small. I never liked grand farewells. I wanted roses from the garden, not florist bundles. Clara handled everything just as I'd asked: soft piano music, a reading from Emily Dickinson, and no open casket. I'd spent a lifetime being looked at. I didn't need one last performance. David and Lynette sat in the front row. David dabbed his eyes occasionally. Lynette wore sunglasses, though it wasn't sunny. I wondered if they grieved the mother they'd lost or the assets they assumed they'd gained. The will was read 5 days later in Mr. Walker's office. Clara had the new copy, pulled carefully from that metal box in the garden shed. She'd found it while her boys were playing tag near the rhubarb bed, just as I knew she would. David arrived in a crisp suit. Lynette wore pearls. They smiled as if the moment belonged to them. Mr. Walker greeted everyone, then unfolded the pages slowly, like a priest holding scripture. "To my beloved son, David," he began. David straightened in his seat. "I leave my love, my memories, and the deep hope that he rediscovers the values he once held as a boy." There was a beat of silence. Mr. Walker continued, his voice unwavering. "All material assets, including the house at 14 Windmere Lane, savings, investments, and personal effects, shall pass to my niece Clara Whitman, whose presence was a light in my final years." Lynette gasped. David leaned forward, hands clenched. "That's not right," Mr. Walker nodded calmly. "This version was notarized 2 months ago, witnessed and filed properly. I have copies of the originals if you'd like to contest it, but I assure you the court won't find grounds." David's face turned red, the kind of red that comes from pride, not grief. "But I'm her son," he hissed. Mr. Walker's expression didn't change. "Yes." And she was aware of that. Clara looked down at her lap, tears brimming. "I didn't ask for any of this," she whispered. "No," Mr. Walker replied, "but you earned it." Lynette stood abruptly. "Come on, David, this is ridiculous." But he didn't move. He just sat there, stunned, as if the air had been sucked from the room, as if he had lost something far more than money, and in a way he had. He'd lost the illusion that his mother would always wait quietly in the wings. Later, Clara walked through the house with her boys trailing behind her. They ran their fingers along the wood banister, laughed as they opened cabinets, found old teacups and forgotten cookie tins. She paused in the den where my typewriter still sat beneath a dust cloth. The manuscript was there, Finished. The last word. Bound with a blue ribbon and a note on top, for you, Clara, and for every woman who was ever erased in the fine print. She clutched it to her chest and whispered, "Thank you." I wonder if David ever understood. That love isn't an inheritance, it's a relationship built, not claimed. And betrayal? Well, it has its own legacy too. I never set out to be remembered. Not in the way people think, not statues or street names or glossy tributes in town bulletins. I only wanted to leave something real. Something that spoke for the quiet women, the overlooked ones. The ones who cooked and sewed and smiled through gritted teeth while the world acted like they were already fading. Clara made sure my words had breath long after mine were gone. She typed every chapter just as I'd written it, preserving the crooked margins and the occasional smudged comma. She kept the title The Last Word, because that's what it was. Not just for me, but for so many like me. When it was printed, she held the first copy in trembling hands. Matte cover. Simple cream and black, no frills, just truth. She dedicated it exactly as I asked, to anyone who's ever been discarded too soon. The local library hosted a reading. Only a handful of people came at first, a few widows, a retired schoolteacher, a young woman who'd been caring for her grandmother. But something happened. Word spread. Book clubs picked it up. Letters started arriving at Clara's door from women who saw themselves in every page. The story wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about remembrance, about refusing to vanish. I watched it unfold from wherever I am now, not through eyes, but through spirit. Through legacy. Through the warmth that bloomed in Clara's cheeks every time she handed a copy to someone and said, "This was my aunt." David didn't come to the launch. He sent a stiff message a month later. No apology, just a question, why? Clara didn't reply. She didn't need to. Some lessons don't come with closure. Some only come with consequences. I may be gone, but my story isn't. And sometimes, that's the only kind of immortality we get, a voice in print. A truth that can't be reburied. A last word, echoing longer than they ever expected. They called me many things in the final years. Old, forgetful, a burden. I heard it in their tone before I ever heard it in their words. The way David sighed when I asked him to reach the good china. The way Lynette pursed her lips when I told the same story more than once. The subtle eye rolls, the fake cheerful visits, the clock watching over coffee, they thought I didn't notice. But I did. Every single time. What they didn't see or chose not to was what I carried inside. The decades of strength, of love given without condition. Of hours spent wiping fevered brows and packing school lunches and staying awake beside hospital beds. Of birthday cakes baked from scratch. Of sacrifices made quietly, willingly. They saw an old woman. I was the foundation, the house they wanted. I scrubbed those floorboards on my hands and knees while David was still learning to walk. The savings they eyed. I clipped coupons, worked weekends at the library, and tucked away pennies when no one was looking. The life they assumed they were entitled to, they forgot who built it. When I overheard my son say I was just waiting to die, something in me broke, but something else, something far more important, awoke. It was clarity. It was the realization that love shouldn't require amnesia, that being someone's mother doesn't mean tolerating being erased. So I did the thing they never expected. I took back my story. I rewrote the end with intention, with purpose, with dignity. I left behind not just a legal document, but a truth, one written in ink, not whispered in hallways. I ensured that what I spent a lifetime building wouldn't fall into the hands of those who saw me as a ledger instead of a legacy. And still, I didn't act in vengeance. I acted in remembrance. For the woman I had been. For the women I knew. For the women who would one day sit alone in a kitchen and wonder if anyone still saw them. Now, when people speak my name, they speak it with warmth. Not because I left them something to inherit, but because I left them something to believe in. Clara told me, in her quiet way, that she reads from my memoir to her children every Sunday. They ask about Aunt Maggie and how she was brave even when no one was looking. She tells them, bravery isn't loud. It's choosing your truth even when you're expected to stay quiet. That's the legacy I wanted, not a headline, not a fortune. Just a voice that couldn't be silenced, even by time. They thought I was a burden, but I was the root, the meals they ate. I cooked them. The home they envied, I built it. The strength they misjudged, I passed it on to someone who would honor it. Roots don't beg for sunlight. They wait patiently beneath the soil, anchoring everything above. And when the storm comes, they are what keeps the whole thing standing. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember their worth. Have you ever felt underestimated by the ones closest to you? Tell us your story in the comments below. Your voice matters. And remember, you're never too old to take the last word.